Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and wherever you are. I recently wrote a short article, short little piece called The Hegelian Spirit of Living and Stopping at the Introduction. So, the Hegelian Spirit of Living. Okay. So, I don't know what possessed me to read the introduction of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Obviously, I've read it at least 3 times, probably. Um, so this would be like my fourth time reading the introduction, and I've never read the rest of the book. I think I stopped at like reason, um, but there was something that Hegel said within the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit that ironically that it was probably the most ironic experience I've ever had reading Hegel, where it basically, in a very weird fashion, justified me or justified itself. I won't say justified me. It justified itself in me stopping and me stopping after the introduction, like not continuing on to read the rest of the phenomenology of spirit. Now I know that sounds maybe heretical, for serious philosophers. It may sound ridiculous to some degree. Like, why would you stop at the introduction? Because it means that you don't understand. You are probably threatening to misread Hegel and misunderstand Hegel. But so this very irony um, is embodied in Hegel's statement in the beginning of the introduction, where he says, the fear of error is the fear of truth itself. So if we take that line seriously, the fear of error is the fear of truth itself. Taking that line seriously means that one who stops after the introduction of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, depending on the person, if they're not afraid of misunderstanding, if they're not afraid of it, they would stop after the introduction. Now, I know this already sounds too jumbled, because people may look at this like, well, I have finished the rest of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, so what does that say about me? So let me bring out what I mean. It doesn't mean people that finish Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is a bad thing, and it doesn't mean that stopping at the introduction of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit is a bad thing. And I will tell you why it's not a bad thing, to either willingly finish it or to willingly stop at the end of the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit. And we can look at this line, and I will kind of extrapolate what I mean by this. So if we go to paragraph 85, where Hegel is talking about the criteria for consciousness, the criteria for truth, he says, but not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion, and what is to be tested are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them, so that since what consciousness examines is its own self, all that is left for us to do is simply to look on. Okay, so if we take seriously what Hegel is saying with the criteria that is already a given within consciousness, then and this is the ironic part, right? The ironic part, if we take this line seriously, is that if I were to say to myself, okay, in order for me to be a good philosopher, I need to finish reading Hegel, right? In order for me to really think, I need to finish reading Hegel. However, the very you've already caught yourself in a trap, right? This is the Hegelian trap, right? The Hegelian trap is that by you saying this and by you affirming this statement, you have already unnecessarily added a extra step towards truth. You have added a criteria for consciousness that you don't need to add. And so if the whole aim of reading Hegel is to get at some specific place, right, as a test, right, to test my worth as a philosopher, I must read Hegel. To test my worth as a human being, I must finish reading the rest of Hegel. If you do that, if you add a criteria, this is the irony. Hegel would say, why are you adding a criteria? Because there's already a criteria that is happening, which is the criteria that is already taking place within consciousness itself between the notion and the object. So why are you adding more? And this is why Hegel says there's no point in testing them, because all you have they will the criteria will take care of itself. So all you have to do is simply look on. And this is the part where Hegel is ironically the purest Lutheran I've probably ever met, because Lutheranism kind of has this understanding of like, okay, um, you're already saved, right? You just have to receive it. Hegel's saying something like that too. However, this is where Hegel is so un-Lutheran, because you see the very concept, or he's Lutheran in the logic of what Hegel, like what Hegel is trying to say. Like Hegel is Lutheran in that sense, but he's not Lutheran in the very creedal agreements, right? Because Lutheranism still believes that you have to come their way to be saved, right? And those that come their way already saved. Okay, so that that is obviously, that kind of Lutheranism is not what I would be referring to when I say Hegel is most Lutheran, but the logic of already being saved is kind of already in that kind of understanding when Hegel's talking about um, the criteria is going to take care of itself. You just have to look on. So it's this looking on that is this kind of demand to have faith, have trust in something other than you. And to have faith and trust in something other than you, it seems for Hegel, would be this very criteria that Hegel's talking about, this criteria that is taking place within consciousness itself. So basically, this demand to look on is ironically Hegel trying to say, have faith, have trust in this process, right? Basically, do not be afraid, even though it may look completely terrifying for you. Do not look afraid. Do not be afraid about this. Um, because obviously, deterring away from it out of fear is, like Hegel says, being afraid of the truth. And being afraid to mess up is also being afraid of the truth. So Hegel is seemingly playing on this doubleness going on. So that's why I said, um, okay, let me just break it down even further, because I feel like there still might be misunderstandings. And obviously, for those that have read Hegel, they may have already grasped what I am saying, whether they agree or not. They kind of grasp what I'm saying. And so basically, what I'm getting at, and this kind of trust that Hegel wants us to have with this looking on. This, it's funny because even Martin Buber calls faith, the original notion of faith is trust. And so Hegel seems to also be implying and enforcing this demand for us to have trust in the process, having trust in the process of the criteria sort of playing itself out, of the unfolding and reaching of truth. And so if you have trust in this process, it gives you courage enough to face what you need to face because, in spite of its threatening nature, you look on, right? You look on. So the fundamental point, if there is one, whether we, are afraid of misunderstanding what Hegel says, if there is a fundamental point, it's that it will take care of itself. And if you do something, we need to be kind of try to be aware of our doing something, because our doing something is in some ways trying to construct a criteria for truth. And in that sense, then we're not having faith. In fact, by not having faith shows that we're extremely afraid of what is before us. And by being afraid of what is before us, we're being afraid of truth. Um, so this line of looking on is very important, and probably the most important, in my opinion, of the whole chapter. Like if I could just read paragraph 85, that's the summary I would give of the whole chapter, because ironically, to get caught up in the details of that chapter, it might distract you so much as to miss the point of the significance of the introduction for, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. It might make you miss this point, but also at the same time, um, it's not up to me, to say that you would need to understand this part of the introduction, right? Because then I would be imposing my own criteria, ironically, um, against Hegel's sort of faithful notion of that the criteria will take care of itself, and so you must look on. So there is this double irony, back and forth. But in my opinion, like I said before, I do feel like the real spirit of the message, the real spirit of what Hegel is saying, and I'm almost even dare to say the real spirit of the whole book is paragraph 85. Paragraph 85. That sort of anything superfluous that we construct is just unnecessary. The criteria will sort of test itself and take care of itself. You just have to look on. And that's why when I read those lines, I immediately understood that I don't have to read the rest of the book. I immediately understood that for me to look on would be to close the book in the truest Hegelian fashion and read something else, encounter something else. Obviously, my fixation recently has been on Kierkegaard. And it's funny because right after the section right after the introduction, I decided to read, Kierkegaard, and it was such a blissful kind of feeling. Um, so yeah, I felt, because in that moment when I decided to read Kierkegaard, it was for the sake of itself, not for the sake of me trying to get anything out specifically from Kierkegaard. And that's why I said, you know, I felt no need to continue reading further with Hegel. It does remind me of, a conversation that me and Daniel Garner had a long, long, long time ago, where I was having a problem with his, developmental schema. Was it like the I it, and Garner was developing it further from like past I thou into I absolute knowing, and so on. And there's this whole developmental schema. and you were saying how all these thinkers are sort of necessary to understand this schema, right? And I said, well, what about the people that will never read these thinkers and so on? And Daniel gave a good answer. He said, it's not about whether they read him or not. It's the fact what's important is that they have the sort of the skill of it, the skill of it. Um, and so, you could say, I understand now what that fully means, even though I understood what it meant. But when I say that I fully understand what it means, is that experientially I have tasted it. And now I understand that, like Hegel is saying, to have a kind of trust in this criteria is exactly kind of like what Daniel is saying, that you just have to have the skill. And the skill would be the Hegelian skill, would be to have trust and faith in this criteria, despite whatever appearances may seem threatening and frightening to the one that is attempting to pursue truth. So basically, it's like Hegel is saying, if you want to pursue truth, you have to pursue truth for the sake of itself. And if you pursue truth for the sake of itself, then you will encounter it. As such, you're already on its way. You're already there. You just have to have faith and trust in this pursuit. Um, and you don't need to test anything because truth will do that for you, because the criteria is already set within the consciousness. So, like Hegel says, you just have to look on. So, it's almost like your whole purpose is to experience and continue to face on and look on despite your despair, despite your grieving, despite your terror of what is confronting you always. As long as you do it for the sake of itself, and not for any other sake of, meaning like the other's sake, or as long as you do it for that sake of, then you are um, pursuing it correctly, basically. And then here's like the whole irony of the whole thing is that there's ironically many Hegelians that are very how can I put this? They're very they're very much like gatekeepers, right? They're almost like dogmatic Hegelians. But what's so funny about this is that they have lost the spirit of Hegelianism by being such protectors and defenders of Hegel, um, in this regard, in this regard, right? Because if you were a true dogmatic Hegelian, you would understand that actually what is most dogmatically Hegelian is this looking on, right? Is this looking on, having this trust and this faith, um, not necessarily getting fixated on the fact that somebody has misunderstood Hegel. Because if you get fixated on that, ironically, what you're doing is you're making Hegel the criteria rather than the criteria that Hegel reveals within the phenomenology of spirit. And see that, and that's the part that we have to be very careful of. And of course, this isn't just applicable to Hegel. This is applicable to literally any relationship, anything that we are encountering. It brings us the wariness of trying not to impose a criteria that is self-constructed, but rather letting the criteria do its thing within our consciousness, and then always adjust accordingly by looking on, right? By sort of like pushing through. Um, and as long as you keep pushing through, to me, that's the Hegelian spirit, because, you can't do it out of personal conviction, because then you're not doing it for the sake of itself. You can't do it for fear of whatever, right? The threat of somebody misunderstanding Hegel, the threat of, whatever dogmatics we have come up with for reading him. uh, we can't do this we can't make these constructions, these criteria out of fear, um, because then already we are afraid to face the truth, as Hegel says. We are avoiding the truth in a very ironic way. So, yeah, I think, and so that's why I basically said, like, this is the most ironic thing I've ever encountered, where I felt no need to read the rest of the Phenomenology of Spirit, because fundamentally I realized at the moment, this could change, but fundamentally at the moment, I realized that if I were to continue reading the rest of Hegel, it would no longer be for the sake of itself. It would be this fixation on either trying to understand him purely, or trying to, one, undermine his system, or attack those who read him, and so on. So that's why I immediately I stopped at the introduction. Like, right when I finished it, I stopped, because I was like, oh, okay, I get it now. I get it now. Where it's like, if I really want to have faith and trust in what Hegel is saying, then I don't even need to finish the rest of his book, right? I just need to simply look on, and basically the question became, what is it that I want to do or would do that is purely for the sake of itself? And in this, at least in this point of time, it's reading, for me, it's reading Kierkegaard. Because I have no further ambitions with Kierkegaard, other than I just want to read him. I have no desires for anything else. It's just literally for the sake of itself. I'm choosing to read Kierkegaard. And just like the way that I decided to randomly read Hegel's introduction, I had no real intention, so to speak. But I noticed that the moment I stopped at the introduction, if I were to continue on, I may start having intentions about doing otherwise. About, basically, I might be adding a criteria that isn't needed, um, and so on. Now, somebody can hear this and see this and read my article and say, well, isn't everything that you're saying because you're interpreting Hegel in a way, and because we have to interpret Hegel, aren't you possibly, um, like, what you think is Hegel's actual criteria, aren't you sort of, already misconstruing what that is, and so on? And I would say, yeah, absolutely, you know, but it's one of those things where it's like, it's a super ironic thing, where it's like, right now, the way I understand it is the forsake of itself, right? Now, like Hegel kind of addresses in the introduction, if I discover in some way that the criteria that Hegel's talking about, or the one that I interpret, isn't really Hegel's criteria, but it's in fact my own secret criteria that I'm imposing on Hegel, on the reading of Hegel, um, then there is no reason for me to mourn and despair over this, right? Because then, ironically, right, if I discover that I did impose my own criteria, when I thought it was Hegel's criteria, there is no need, right? This is ironically me realizing that, right? If I were to realize my mistake, um, me acknowledging that would be the proof of Hegel's criteria playing out, right? And so the demand once more would be to look on, and who knows, maybe I will be driven again to read another part of Hegel's phenomenology spirit, or never again. I don't know. I don't know. But the real question that I have to keep in the back of my mind is, are you doing this for the sake of itself? And in a more clear fashion, are you doing this for the sake of truth itself? Or are you doing this for um, some type of agenda? some type of agenda. And see, that's the danger that I immediately acknowledged, was that if I continue to read Hegel, I might end up doing it for a kind of agenda. So it's best, and this is why I said I felt no need to continue further, because I realized immediately that to stay true to the Hegelian spirit would be to not have some type of secret agenda. And so the only thing that I could think of at the time, today, the only thing that I don't have a secret agenda with is Kierkegaard. Right? I can just read Kierkegaard and not think anything of it. Um, you know, so yes, that is, and yep, that is my justification. And again, if if you guys disagree and all that stuff, as long as we acknowledge, like, this disagreement isn't you trying to impose a criteria on me, and me trying to impose a criteria on you. I am, if we understand anything out of this, is that I encountered a kind of understanding of what it means to look on. And so in all intentions, I'm confessing that I am attempting to do this for the sake of itself, rather than me imposing a criteria, right? And so if this appeals to you, if this appeals to you in some way, what I am saying, then feel free to equally apply it as such. But if it doesn't appeal to you, then like I said, we have to essentially trust the criteria. I am not here to prove any criteria, like Hegel says. The criteria will play itself out. I have to simply look on. But it's within this wanting to look on that I discovered, like I said, that I don't need to read the rest of it, because I feel like I understood the spirit of it all. And if there's ever a point in time where I feel again to either read parts of Hegel, or to never read Hegel, as long as I am doing it for the sake of itself and not for the sake of some agenda or criteria to reach something, then I can argue in that sense. I feel like I am staying true to the most Hegelian spirit, um, and that we are all attempting to stay true to the Hegelian spirit. And it doesn't necessarily demand that you read Hegel, because the Hegelian spirit is not a dogmatic demand on Hegel himself as a figure, but rather on what Hegel is pointing us to. Hegel is wanting to shift our eyes on something. And this shifting our eyes on something is this notion of for the sake of itself. If you pursue truth for the sake of itself. And it's always going to be dialectical, because you have to understand that there's going to be failures, that there's going to be moments when you realize retroactively that you didn't do it for the sake of itself, but it's okay. And this is what Hegel would say. At least I feel like Hegel would say, but it's okay. You look on, right? It's already playing out. It's already doing its thing. So you look on, right? You continue to attempt to believe that you are doing it for the sake of itself. And there, and in that very moment, in my opinion, there is that sort of Lutheran sentiment that you're already saved, so to speak. But like Lutherans say, right? You're already saved, but you have to receive it. But of course, don't equate but of course, when I say Hegel is Lutheran, it's not really Lutheran, right? This is the irony of it all. Because Lutheranism decides to have a criteria for believing and organizing religion and what it believes, right? But Hegel is saying no, they don't. Lutheranism doesn't even need a criteria, right? It doesn't even need to construct one. None of us do, right? The consciousness already has its own criteria, right? And so that is what we need to have faith in, and look on. So we don't need to apply. And so that's what makes Hegel, ironically, the most Lutheran out of Lutherans, and yet also, ironically, the most un-Lutheran out of all Lutherans. Because it's not, he breaks that complete logic apart. And I think that is what's ironic about the whole thing. But yes, I think I've said everything that I need to say for my essay that I wrote. And even if you didn't read the essay, you guys don't need to read it. This video is enough to kind of get the whole exposition of it all. But yeah, okay. All right, guys. Take care.